Good morning, everyone. So, in the 8 o'clock service and in the beginning of this service, both Daniel and Helen have taken my introduction by noting that this is one of the best known narratives, the narrative of David and Goliath. Daniel and I were having a conversation about this a couple of weeks ago, saying that even in the school when kids who don't know anything, they always know the story of David and Goliath. The classic struggle of the weak versus the strong. In our sermon last week, Daniel highlighted that we are watching Israel become a nation. And in doing so, we're seeing politics come out. Today's passage is further evidence of these growing pains. Israel faces challenges to protect its borders, and there are also further challenges with the establishment of the monarchy and its military leaders. And it's all coming to a juncture in this battle. So we've got a battle of the weak, David, Israel, versus a battle of the strong, Goliath and the Philistines. And when thinking about this battle of the weak and the strong, and I was contemplating my sermon preparation, one scene kept playing through my head, just kept playing over and over. Some of you may know it. Thanks, Noah.
Are you saying that Britain should not support law and justice?
No, of course we should, Prime Minister. We just shouldn't let it affect our foreign policy.
We should always fight for the weak against the strong.
Well, then why don't we send troops to Afghanistan to fight the Russians?
The Russians are too strong.
The weak against the strong. That is, of course, the timeless BBC series of Yes, Prime Minister from an episode A Victory for Democracy. Worth a watch, or worth a rewatch. Timeless. The weak versus the strong. The David and Goliath story. A battle of the underdog. A story theme that has replayed throughout history. It's reflected in literature, art, entertainment. We've seen that with the Yes, Prime Minister. And it's a theme that you would undoubtedly find playing out if you take any form of news that you like to consume and have a look at it. You would see a detailed description of the weak battling the strong, a fight for justice, a fight against unfairness. This theme ripples around the world time and time again at many different levels. Nations, groups, individuals, sporting teams. All these people struggling, internal politics, external politics, they're all battling and posing force surrounding ideological pressures. They're trying to exert their own physical prowess, all the while vying for that ultimate victory, a victory over their opponent, the victory over the Goliath in their way. This classic David and Goliath narrative is understood by the world. But we need to stop and pause, because as we have seen over the last couple of weeks in our 1 Samuel sermon series, that's not what this story is about. This story of David and Goliath is not a story of the weak versus the strong. And how do we know this? Because we've seen in the last couple of weeks, but in our reading today, that David is backed and supported by God. And I don't think anyone in here would claim that God is the weaker party in this narrative. So if this story is not about the weak versus the strong, does it instead have a moral lesson for us? Is this passage asking us to look at the behaviour and actions of David? Are we to see David as a faithful and obedient follower of God, and thus come to the conclusion that we should be more like David? And that if we are successful in being more like David, then we will have the ability to beat the Goliaths in our lives, whatever the Goliaths in our lives happen to be, those big, hard, difficult challenges in our lives. Or is the story suggesting that when we battle these big, hard, difficult challenges, that we should be appropriately equipped, we should have on the right armour? Just like David had to work out his armour and what weapons he was going to take into his fight with Goliath, we are also being called to consider what is the correct armour for us when we go out and fight our Goliaths. 3 possible conclusions: the weak versus the strong, being faithful like David, and having the correct armour on. These 3 possible conclusions are often associated with these passages. And while all of those conclusions have some interesting and helpful elements for us to consider, they're not what this passage is about. We are not to read into this passage that the answer to what our armour is most appropriate for us in our battles. We get an answer to what armour we should wear in other parts of the Bible, think Isaiah and Ephesians, but not this story. This passage does not have a moral implication for us. We are not to see the message of this passage that because David was upright and righteous, a man after God's own heart, we should try and be more like him. Instead, for us to understand what this passage is really about, we need to draw on our understanding of the purpose and structure of Old Testament narrative. So I'm going to ask if you would please indulge the academic in me, and my apologies to anyone who has recently been in an English class, teacher or student. But we're going to have a little look at biblical Old Testament narrative using David and Goliath as our example. Just a little detour. Commentators tell us that the narratives in the Old Testament are purposeful retellings of historical events that are intended through inspiration of the Holy Spirit to give meaning and direction to the present. In general, we know that biblical narratives tell the ultimate story of God's work throughout history. However, to appreciate the message in these stories, we need to be reminded of a few basic things about narratives. All narratives have 3 main parts: the characters, often including the protagonist and the antagonist, and in some cases there is also a third character, the agonist. There is the plot, often involving some kind of conflict or issue that needs resolving, and of course the plot resolution. Drilling down a little bit more, when we look at biblical narrative, there are 3 levels of biblical narrative within each story. So the third, or the top level, is the one we have just described here, and it's often called the meta-narrative. This level has to do with the whole universal plan of God worked out through creation and focuses primarily on God's chosen people. It's the redemption story. It's the big redemption story. That's the top level. The second level is the story of God's redeeming a people for his name. Think the covenant promises. And it's coming up, there'll be a covenant promise that God makes with David. That happens in 2 Samuel. And then the first level is the hundreds of individual stories that make up those other 2 levels. So it's the small stories, it's the David and Goliath stories, it's the David being anointed, it's about Saul's family, it's all of those individual stories. So that's how they separate out those stories. Let us now pivot a little bit and have a little bit of a look at the characters in these biblical narratives. Bible characters are sometimes good and sometimes evil. Sometimes they're wise and sometimes they're foolish. And if you follow the story about David, we certainly know that that's very true about him. So it is important for us to note that while we can learn a great deal from Old Testament characters, we are not to assume that God expects us to do exactly the same thing that those characters do. Nor are we to assume that the same thing that happens to those Bible characters will happen to us. We are not to assume that what happened to David in his battle with Goliath is what is going to happen to us. But rather, the take-home message in this passage and in the sermon series we've seen so far is that we, like the Israelites, need a true king and a true champion, and that ultimately that person is Christ. So that's the conclusion, but we have to go back now and see how we get there. And I'm going to stick with this idea of the characters, and I want to do a little bit of a compare and contrast, and we're going to compare the role of the champion, David versus Goliath, and we're going to compare the role of the king, David versus Saul. If you find it helpful to have your Bibles out at 1 Samuel chapter 17, please feel free to do that. All right, so our narrative opens and we are given a picture of what this champion is. The Hebrew word literally means the man of the betweens, or the man between the two. This is giving us an idea that the role of the champion was to stand between the two opposing armies. The blessing of a champion was that the champion's fight allowed the battle to be decided between the two champions in the middle, rather than the all-out loss of life that would happen if full warfare occurred. And the story opens giving us a description of this Philistine champion, Goliath. Thanks for the next slide. We are given this lengthy description of Goliath. I put some pictures there up of what might have been his armour. It's hard to say. If it was Greek, your armour's much easier to find a picture of. Philistine armour's not as good. But this might be something like what his armour looked like. We get a very clear idea that this champion was physically opposing, and we get minute details of his armour and weaponry. Through these descriptions, it is made very clear to us that the Philistines have a champion of ominous power, terrifying strength, and seemingly virtual invincibility. Just because we're looking at Hebrew narratives, we need to pause here and note that there is significance associated with the level of detail given to Goliath's appearance. Typically, in Hebrew narratives, characterisation was not associated with a description of appearances. So when detailed descriptions are given, such as here with Goliath, his armour and his weapons, we need to stop and ask why. And the commentators suggest that there are actually spiritual meanings associated with this description of Goliath's appearance. The descriptions, you see this coat of scale armour, lead the reader to associate Goliath with the great dragon, this ancient serpent. We often hear it called the devil and Satan. We get a further connection. There is other connections with the use of the word bronze and the spearhead. You can see those on the slides. There is a further connection to the spiritual nature of this battle, and it is given in what Goliath roars at the Israelite army, where he specifically defies the armies of the living God. So by the time we arrive at the end of verse 11, we as the audience or the reader can see that Israel is not just facing a formidable foe in battle, but this fight with the Philistines is reflective of a deeper spiritual war that has existed since their fall into sin, and which is the Lord's primary focus in all of his redemptive acts on behalf of his people. It's the meta-narrative, that broader picture that the story is ultimately trying to draw our attention to, which is God's redemption plan. Rejoining the story in verse 11, the scene is set. The Philistines have lined up for battle. They've got this huge man, Goliath. He's come out and he's roaring challenges. What next? The Israelites, they need a champion too. And this is where we're going to connect what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. We've seen in the last weeks that Israel went to God and said, we want a king because we want to be like the surrounding nations. So God gave them a king, and now they need a champion. And just like in the king, they wanted to be like the surrounding nations, they want a champion. We assume that they want a champion, probably a bit like Goliath. They wouldn't mind if their champion was also big and opposing and pretty handy with a big spear. But if we look at chapter 9, we'll see that they're already supposed to have a champion in Saul. Chapter 9, verse 2, Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. So Israel already have the tallest Israelite. Added to this, Saul is their king, and we know that when people demanded that Saul be king, they said to God, "We want a king over us. Then we'll be like the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles." Saul's the king. He's been anointed by God. He is the king the people asked for. And the people expected that this king would lead and fight the Israelite battles. He's already the tallest that they have. Saul is the obvious choice to go out and be the one to fight Goliath. He should be acting as a champion. So where's Saul? He's hiding way behind the back ranks, terrified. He's hiding out in his tent. He doesn't want to have anything to do with this champion. He's not fulfilling his kingly role. And we saw this in last week why he wasn't doing this. Saul has been told, "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time." Saul is frightened because he had turned away from the Lord. He had not obeyed God's commands. His heart is not for the Lord. And because of this, Saul knows that God has withdrawn his support of his rule. The consequence is that while Saul ought to be ruling, he ought to be out leading the people in battle, winning the battle, he's frightened, defeated, and scared. So at this point in the narrative, us, the reader, are led to ask the question, who will save God's people? Who will fulfill the roles of king and champion? What kind of battle is it we are fighting? We begin to see how the story is going to answer these questions when we get to our third and contrasting character, which is, of course, David. We are reintroduced to David in verse 12, and it is a very interesting thing that it's a reintroduction. It's a full reintroduction. Verse 12 says, "Now David was the son of an Epaphraite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem and in Judea. Jesse had 8 sons, etc., etc., so on." We are then told David was the youngest, and David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. We're given it's a full-blown reintroduction. Some commentators suggest that the need to reintroduce David is because of David's seeming outward insignificance. David is the 8th son. He's not old enough to fight. He's not of significant stature. He undertakes menial tasks like sheep tending, and he's only up at the front lines because he's delivering meals to his brothers. However, despite the fact that David appears insignificant to the Israelites, we've already seen God's perspective. In chapter 16, verse 7, when David was secretly anointed by Saul, we are told the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. It was very clear that God is telling us that while humans judge on outward appearance, as the Israelites have done when they chose Saul, the Lord looks on the heart. He is looking for someone with a heart to serve him, to be our champion. So, returning to our story, David's up there delivering meals to his brothers, and he hears Goliath's defiant charge to Israel and her God. You'll see that in verse 23. David initially attempts to motivate Saul's men into facing Goliath. That is unsuccessful, so then David makes the decision to go to Saul and offer to fight Goliath. At that point, David faces derision from his brothers for this decision. However, David proceeds. He goes and tells Saul he will fight, and then we get this comic scene of David trying on Saul's untested armour and weapons. Just as a note, I think it's interesting the description of Goliath's armour compared to the description of David's armour. Another interesting contrast that the story gives us. David eventually rejects this whole armour. He can't walk in it, he can't use it, he doesn't know how to fight it, and he's never tried. Instead, he says, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hands of this Philistine." And there is our contrast. Unlike Saul, David does have a heart for the Lord. David firmly believes and has experienced a God who rescues his people. David's belief in God's faithfulness and protection is so strong that he is willing to risk his life on it. Just as 1,000 years later, there was a man who believed in God's love, faithfulness, and protection. A man who risked his life for the belief that God would never ever let one of his people go. And that belief was so strong that that man went to the cross. And on the third day, he was proved right. That the living God has never ever let go of a believer. He's never ever abandoned a believer under pressure. And that's what David foreshadows. The story moves on. David goes out to face Goliath. When David appears before Goliath, like David's brother before the battle, despise and reject David. Goliath says to David, "Am I a dog that you would come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Just as 1,000 years later, another man was despised and rejected. But David says, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." I just want you to note the significance of the words cutting off the head. Again, this is language that draws to mind in the reader the meta-narrative, the spiritual battle that is occurring. David is declaring to all watching that they are not just fighting him, but they are setting themselves against God. God does save. He saves the believer, saves everyone who belongs to him, but he does not do it by strength or cleverness or wealth or power or brute force. Instead, he saves by means of a champion in weakness who trusts in him. And that is the sense of this great narrative. The victory had been won the moment a champion appeared on the scene whose heart was right before God. God's champion was indignant to see the forces of evil winning in the world. The champion really believed, even in the direst of circumstance, that God rescues those who trust him. And even though he is despised and rejected, the champion is prepared to put his life on the line, and the victory is won. David, a better champion than Goliath. David, a better king than Saul. Jesus, the ultimate king, the ultimate champion, who was despised and rejected and seemingly weak, but who had a heart for God's work and in God's strength won the victory. But our task is not yet complete. Having followed the contextual clues to see Jesus in this narrative, we need to ask, where do we see ourselves in this story? We know we don't see ourselves in David, and it is not Saul, and it is not Goliath. But I would like to suggest now that we can see ourselves in the Israelite army, who are inspired by David's victory to join the battle and plunder. And we see from verse 51, "When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp." There is a call here for us in that not only are we meant to be recipients of the great substitutionary work of this man in between, Jesus, but we are meant to join in his fight. And we can think about joining in this champion fight by looking at some other passages from the New Testament. Romans chapter 16 verse 20 says, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet." In these verses, we are called to share the promise that God himself will crush Satan under our feet. Note Paul's careful grammar here. God himself is the one crushing Satan, and he happens to be using our feet. And in Luke chapter 10, in the story where Jesus sends out the 72 return, and then Jesus says to them, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to go overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. However, do not rejoice that the Spirit submits to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven." Elsewhere, Paul talks about Christian warfare, encouraging us to put on the Messiah's armour and to participate in this fight against sin and Satan. Notably, that's Ephesians chapter 6. And through those passages, we understand that our weapons and warfare are not physical. Just as Jesus fought with words and deeds and the cross, we are to fight with weapons like faith, peace, and the word of God. Ephesians 6 verses 12, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand." All of these passages remind us that we are not the authors of this victory. We are not the champions. We are not to become mini Davids and beat our modern day Goliaths. But our task instead is to make quite sure that we are part of David's great-grandson's army. We are to behave like soldiers, pursuing at the end, following the ultimate champion, following our king. By God's grace, we are simultaneously recipients of his great victory and participants in the battle of the ages. And we are to be deeply encouraged and emboldened in this spiritual fight, knowing that the victory has been won. Jesus had conquered the giants of sin and Satan decisively. And that is David and Goliath, this wonderful narrative, a true story about the nature of our true king and true champion fulfilled in Jesus. Let's pray. Jesus Christ, we praise you that though you were despised and rejected, that you came from outside, you came to be our champion and our king. As it says in Colossians 2 verse 15, "Having disarmed the powers and authorities, you made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." We yearn now, Jesus, for that day when your victory will be visible for all to see. We ask that in the meantime you give us confidence to trust you, to join your army. As we join with you, may we be able to stand our ground and fearlessly make known your